One of the near-death cases preserved in Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross's clinical notes begins with a 10-year-old boy admitted to a children's hospital in Chicago, Illinois, in September 1978. The patient, Michael James Anderson, born April 12, 1968, had end-stage acute lymphoblastic leukemia diagnosed earlier that year. Doctors had followed him since February. Over 7 months, they witnessed not only the relentless advance of the illness, but the unusual calm with which this child faced his own mortality. Michael was the second child of John Anderson, a reserved civil engineer, and Rebecca Anderson, a literature teacher who rarely left her son's bedside during repeated hospital stays. The family lived in quiet Evanston, just north of Chicago. Ordinary rhythms of a Midwestern suburb outside, sterile rooms inside. The smell of disinfectant mingled with the soft fragrance of lilies Rebecca brought each week. Within those walls, something extraordinary began to surface in Michael's awareness. Nurse Margaret Hill, who led the pediatric floor, noted in her charts that Michael asked strikingly clear questions about dying. He didn't display the expected terror. Instead, he showed a steady curiosity that unsettled the adults around him. He often asked what happens when the body sleeps for good, and he spoke with gentle conviction about good people around his bed at night when the corridor lights dimmed and the ward went quiet. From the first weeks of treatment, he described recurring dreams. A field washed in luminous blue where the wind seemed to carry words, and faces held a kindness he couldn't find in the hospital's daily visitors. Dr. Kübler-Ross, who had accompanied many terminal children, learned of these accounts through the team's notes and conversations with Rebecca. Michael showed no signs of medication-induced confusion. His reports were consistent, detailed, and peaceful, an unsettling contrast to his weakening body. On the humid night of August 3rd, as Chicago sweltered, Michael crashed. Around 10:47 p.m., during a fever spike with severe respiratory distress, he went into full cardiopulmonary arrest. 2 residents and a nurse launched resuscitation. Chest compressions followed pediatric protocol. Pure oxygen flowed through a manual bag. The monitor traced the stark, flat line of asystole. Medications were pushed in sequence. After roughly 5 minutes, a faint, irregular pulse flickered back. Michael's heart resumed, but his awareness did not. He remained deeply unconscious for the next 12 hours. At dawn on August 4th, pale light filtering through blue curtains, he opened his eyes, without the disorientation common after a rest. He looked for his mother immediately, sleeping in a chair, and spoke words she would never forget. He said he had been awake on the ceiling, watching his own body while the team fought to restart his heart. He described where each person stood, the residents' hand movements during compressions, and the exact moment Nurse Margaret, off-duty that night, rushed in at the code and raised a hand to her face in a stifled gasp. But his account didn't end there. Michael said a light, golden, soft, not painful, wrapped around him and drew him away from the room, across a place he couldn't name, into the blue field from his dreams. Only now it wasn't a dream. It was more real than real. Grass moved to a breeze that felt like language or music, or both. Trees seemed to sing, resonating with the wind, filling everything with a sense of wholeness he had never felt while awake. It was there, in that radiant blue field, that Michael met 2 figures he instantly recognized, though he had never seen them before, Thomas and Evelyn Miller. They were not strangers. Deep inside, he somehow knew they were his grandparents, his mother's parents, who had both died long before he was born. Thomas, once a factory worker from Detroit, appeared strong yet kind, his smile filled with warmth. Evelyn, a gentle schoolteacher with soft eyes, stood beside him, her presence calm and familiar. They greeted him with the nickname Mikey, a name used only within his family, one never mentioned in the hospital. That detail struck his mother later, because no one outside their home used it. They didn't speak for long. Their words were few, but carried an echo that seemed to vibrate inside him rather than reach him through his ears. They told him it wasn't time yet, that there was still a path he had to walk, lessons to learn, a journey not yet finished. Before Michael could ask what they meant, another presence appeared. He couldn't describe it as a person. It was made of light, a brilliance beyond color, yet it didn't blind. It radiated such overwhelming love that Michael felt he could dissolve into it without fear. This being didn't speak in human words, but its meaning reached him perfectly clear. It showed him something like a vision. He saw a baby being born, small, pink, crying its first cry in a place he didn't recognize. But along with the image came a deep knowing. That baby was him. Not a symbol, not a dream, but his own soul beginning again. The light told him gently that this would be him when the sun returns, and that there was nothing to fear. Death, the voice said, was not an ending but a doorway, a transition to another beginning. Michael didn't receive a date or time. Instead, he felt a quiet certainty, as if time itself didn't move the same way there. Then, suddenly, the light pulled him back, through the same golden glow, through the nameless space, until he felt the weight of his small, frail body again, the beeping machines, the ache in his bones, the smell of disinfectant, and the warmth of his mother's hand. When he awoke, he spoke softly, telling Rebecca everything he'd seen. She listened, torn between disbelief and awe. Over the following days, he repeated the story, adding details he could never have invented. His mother began to write them down. Quer que eu siga direto com a parte 3, de 14, que cobre a fase de entrevistas da doutora Kübler-Ross e as mudanças no comportamento de Michael após o episódio? In the days that followed, Dr. Kübler-Ross personally visited the hospital to observe Michael. She had read countless reports of near-death experiences, but this case carried a different weight. The precision of the details, the calm tone of his recollection. It was as if the boy had seen something far beyond the limits of his fragile body. She interviewed his doctors, nurses, and his mother, carefully documenting every element of the story. Yet what struck her most wasn't the description of the blue field or the golden light. It was the change that took hold of Michael afterward. Before the cardiac arrest, he had already shown an unusual acceptance of his illness. But after coming back, he seemed to have crossed an invisible threshold. He no longer feared death. Instead, he embraced it as something natural, something filled with meaning. He told his mother not to cry, that she would see him again, only with a different name. His voice, thin and tired, carried a confidence that silenced any attempt at denial. Rebecca, still anchored in her Protestant upbringing, found herself struggling to understand her son's words. To her, the concept of being reborn belonged to other cultures, to distant philosophies, not to a small boy from Illinois. But Michael spoke with a clarity that left no room for fantasy. He began to draw incessantly. With colored pencils and hospital paper, he filled page after page with images of the place he called the blue field. Trees that glowed, winds that sang. A bridge made of light stretching over a dark space that, he explained, wasn't bad, just different. He often drew a baby surrounded by that same golden glow, crying softly, and underneath he wrote in his shaky handwriting, "Me." Nurse Margaret Hill, a veteran of over 20 years in pediatric care, reported an incident that left her deeply moved. A few days after Michael's crisis, while checking his vitals, he looked at her and said, "You were scared that night. You thought I wouldn't come back, but you prayed anyway." She froze. Margaret had indeed whispered a silent prayer during the code, something she had never told anyone. How could he know? She asked the doctor later, her hands trembling. He was gone. He wasn't breathing, but he knew. Dr. Kübler-Ross listened quietly, taking notes, her scientific mind struggling to balance skepticism with empathy. She had heard similar claims before, yet every time they defied explanation. Michael's behavior continued to change. He began asking to visit other children in the ward. His mother would wheel him from room to room, and there he would talk to patients who were frightened and in pain. He told them not to be afraid, that good people were waiting for them, that beyond the pain there was a garden filled with music and color, and that nobody was ever truly gone. Nurses noticed that after talking to him, some children slept better. Some even began drawing blue fields of their own. Doctor. Kübler-Ross documented everything with the same precision she applied to all her research. Each statement, each drawing, every word from the nurses went into her notes. Her training demanded objectivity, yet she couldn't ignore the questions that rose within her. Was this simply the result of oxygen deprivation in the brain, a hallucination born from crisis? Could neurotransmitters, flooding a dying mind, create something so coherent and transformative? Those explanations were plausible, and yet insufficient. Michael's story contained details that challenged logic. He had described the exact position of medical staff during resuscitation, details later confirmed by every witness in the room. He even mentioned Margaret Hill's gesture of covering her face, something no one else had told him. These elements mirrored dozens of cases she had gathered over the years, different ages, cultures, and faiths, yet all describing light, peace, and an overwhelming sense of love. Still, what made Michael's case unique was the conviction with which he spoke about returning. He didn't hope, he knew. To him, death wasn't an end, but a continuation. In her notes, Dr. Kübler-Ross compared his language to patterns she had seen in spiritual traditions around the world. In Hinduism, she wrote, the cycle of life and death, samsara, suggested consciousness continues through many forms. In Tibetan Buddhism, the bardos described stages between lives. Even in Jewish mysticism, she noted, the Gilgul Neshamot spoke of the soul's migration. But Michael had no exposure to any of these ideas. His family were occasional Methodists. He had never heard of reincarnation. How, then, could a 10-year-old describe it with such precision, not as belief, but as memory? The doctor refused to jump to conclusions. Science must not rush toward the mystical, she often told her students, but neither should it turn away from what it cannot yet explain. She documented the phenomenon for what it was, a profound psychological and spiritual transformation following a near-death event. Whether the cause was biological, metaphysical, or something beyond current understanding, she left open. Michael's condition, however, continued to decline. The leukemia resisted every treatment available in the 1970s. Transfusions only delayed the inevitable. Yet paradoxically, as his body weakened, his spirit seemed to grow stronger. He comforted his mother. When she wept, he wiped her tears and whispered, "It's only for a while. We'll see each other again." He spoke with such serenity that even seasoned nurses left the room in tears. His presence began to transform everyone around him. Doctors, nurses, other parents, all found themselves quietly changed by the boy who faced death as if it were simply another kind of sunrise. By mid-September, it became clear to everyone at the hospital that Michael's time was running out. His leukemia no longer responded to any medication, and his frail body could no longer fight the infections that came one after another. Rebecca, who had spent months torn between desperate hope and exhausted acceptance, now found herself guided by her son. It was he, the dying child, who comforted her. He held her hand when she cried and whispered, "It's okay, Mom. You don't have to be sad. I'll come back, just different." John Anderson, Michael's father, struggled in silence. A man of few words, he had buried his emotions beneath layers of discipline and reason. But as the end approached, even he could no longer hide the tremor in his voice or the tears he tried to blink away. The hospital room, once sterile and full of mechanical sounds, began to feel like something sacred. The nurses dimmed the lights. Rebecca brought flowers that filled the air with a faint, living scent. Sometimes the boy would hum softly, the melody of a lullaby his mother used to sing when he was small. On the night of September 18th, Michael drifted in and out of consciousness. His breathing grew shallow, each pause a little longer than the last. Rebecca sat beside him, her fingers never leaving his hand. She sang the same lullaby, the same tune that had once lulled him to sleep when the world was still simple. At 2:16 a.m. on September 20th, 1978, his breathing stopped. No struggle, no panic, only a final exhale, like a sigh of relief. The machines traced their silent line. The nurses stood still. Rebecca leaned over, kissed his forehead, and whispered what he had asked her to say when the time came. "See you soon. Not goodbye, just see you soon." Tears came, but not the wild grief she had feared. There was sorrow, yes, deep and raw, but also something else. A peace she couldn't quite name, as though Michael's certainty had passed into her like light into water. For hours she sat by his side, holding his cooling hand, whispering words only a mother could speak, not to a memory, but to the boy who somehow still felt near. When the doctors finally recorded the time of death and left her alone for a moment, Rebecca looked out the window. The Chicago night sky was clear, sprinkled with stars. She remembered Michael's words about the light that didn't burn, the blue field, the wind that sang. And in that quiet, she felt, for just a heartbeat, that he was already home. In the months that followed Michael's passing, Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross carefully reviewed every note, every testimony, and every drawing related to his case. She had witnessed hundreds of children face the end of life, but something in Michael's story stayed with her, something that refused to fit neatly into the categories of science or psychology. His experience echoed the same patterns she had found in countless near-death accounts: the radiant light, the encounter with deceased loved ones, the sense of peace and unconditional love, the reluctance to return to the body. Yet, two elements stood apart. The first was the verifiable accuracy of his perception during cardiac arrest, details that matched what medical staff confirmed afterward. The second was his absolute conviction that life would continue, not abstractly, but personally, that he would live again. Dr. Kübler-Ross approached the case with her signature balance of rigor and openness. She didn't rush to label the experience as proof of an afterlife, nor did she dismiss it as hallucination. In her clinical notes, she wrote that such phenomena should not be reduced to delusion nor elevated to dogma, but examined as valuable data on how the human mind, or soul, perceives the boundary between life and death. She compared Michael's drawings and statements with similar cases she had documented since 1972. Many patients, both children and adults, spoke of a radiant realm of color and sound, often describing a light that thinks. Yet Michael's version carried an innocence that seemed untouched by cultural influence, as if it came directly from the source. The doctor reflected that perhaps symbols like the blue field, the bridge of light, or the new baby were archetypes, universal metaphors of transformation appearing across cultures. From the ancient Greek mysteries of Eleusis to Tibetan teachings on the Bardo, humanity had always used such imagery to express death not as annihilation, but as renewal. Still, she couldn't ignore the deeper question: why do these symbols appear most vividly in those standing at the edge of life? She often shared Michael's case during lectures to physicians, psychologists, and hospice workers. Her voice remained calm, clinical, but her eyes carried warmth. She would ask, "When a dying child describes beauty beyond comprehension, what do we do with that story? Do we erase it because it challenges our instruments, or do we listen, truly listen, and let it expand the horizon of what we call reality?" Her audiences rarely had answers. Most left silent, thoughtful, sometimes teary-eyed. For the doctor, Michael's story became a reminder that science and spirit do not have to be enemies. "Perhaps," she once wrote, "our task is not to prove what lies beyond death, but to prepare our hearts to meet it without fear." 4 years after Michael's passing, in the spring of 1982, Dr. Kübler-Ross received a letter. It came on delicate cream-colored stationery, the handwriting neat but slightly shaky, a mother's hand, marked by time and memory. The signature at the bottom read, "Rebecca Anderson." Rebecca began by expressing gratitude for the compassion and dignity with which the doctor had treated her son. But soon her tone shifted. She wrote that something extraordinary had happened, something she couldn't explain, yet couldn't deny. Her younger sister, Catherine Miller, had given birth to a boy on May 3, 1980, about 19 months after Michael's death. The child's name was Daniel Miller, a bright, healthy baby who grew into a cheerful, curious toddler. But when Daniel turned 3, he began to say things that froze the entire family. Simple phrases, spoken in that innocent, broken grammar of small children, yet impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while looking at an old family photo album, Daniel pointed to a picture of Rebecca and said, "That's my mom, my other mom." At first, everyone laughed, thinking it was just a child's imagination. But then he added softly, "I came back to see her, but she's far away." Rebecca wrote that she could barely breathe when Catherine told her those words. The boy had never met her, they lived in different cities, and no one had ever spoken of Michael's story in front of him. Weeks later, Daniel said something even more chilling and beautiful. While sitting by the window one evening, he whispered, "I know the blue field. Grandma Evelyn is there." Catherine dropped the book she was reading. Evelyn Miller, their mother, had died in 1962, long before either child was born. The phrase "blue field" had been mentioned only in Rebecca's private conversations with Dr. Kübler-Ross and in Michael's own drawings, which were never shown outside the home. "How could he know that?" she wrote. "How could he say those names, those words, as if they belonged to him?" Rebecca didn't claim certainty. She wasn't saying Daniel was Michael. But she confessed that when she met the boy for the first time, he looked at her with eyes that felt hauntingly familiar. The same quiet gaze, the same half-smile her son used to give when he tried to comfort her. "Maybe it's imagination," she wrote, "or maybe it's love finding its way back." She ended her letter with a single line that Dr. Kübler-Ross underlined twice in her journal. "Whether or not Daniel is Michael, I know that what my son told me was true. Death is not the end. It is only a doorway." When Dr. Kübler-Ross finished reading Rebecca's letter, she closed her office blinds and sat in silence for a long while. She had spent decades studying the threshold between life and death. But this was different. She reread the last lines again. "Whether or not Daniel is Michael, I know what my son told me was true. Death is only a doorway." The words struck her like a quiet revelation. They captured what she had tried to communicate for years through lectures and research. That death wasn't an event to be feared, but a transition, a continuation of consciousness in some form science had yet to measure. Still, the scientist in her refused to let emotion override discipline. In her notes, she wrote, "Anecdotal correlation does not equal proof, but these narratives must not be ignored. They reveal a consistent psychological and spiritual pattern that science, for now, lacks language to describe." She considered every possible explanation. Could Daniel have overheard fragments of conversation? Could collective memory, stories, gestures, even silence, have somehow transmitted the idea of Michael's blue field? It was possible, she admitted, but still, too precise, too intimate. During conferences, she began mentioning Michael's case, always carefully, never sensationalized. She would describe the sequence of medical facts, then share the drawings, then end with a simple question. If the human mind can generate love and peace even as the body dies, what does that tell us about who we really are? Her audiences often sat motionless afterward. Some skeptics dismissed the account as wishful thinking. Others, nurses, chaplains, grieving parents, approached her in tears, whispering stories of their own. To Dr. Kübler-Ross, this was the point. Not to convert or convince, but to open a space where mystery and evidence could coexist. She wrote in her journal that science might one day create instruments capable of mapping the final moments of consciousness. But until then, the testimonies of the dying remained the closest thing to a compass humanity possessed. Perhaps, she noted, the mistake is believing we must choose between reason and reverence. Maybe both are needed to touch the truth. Michael's story, and the echo of his name in the laughter of a boy called Daniel, became part of her lectures for years to come. She never called it proof of reincarnation, but rather an invitation to humility. For her, the case reminded the medical community that behind every heartbeat was not just biology, but mystery, and that sometimes the smallest patients were the greatest teachers. Over time, Michael's story became more than a medical case. It became a mirror for the limits of human understanding. In her public lectures, Dr. Kübler-Ross often described it not as proof of life after death, but as evidence of how much we still don't know. We have instruments that measure the heartbeat, she would say, but none that measure the soul. She began to speak about death not as a wall, but as a frontier, one that could only be approached through humility and compassion. For her, the process of dying revealed the essence of life itself. Many in the medical community resisted her ideas, accusing her of bringing mysticism into science. But she never argued back with anger. Instead, she invited skepticism, real skepticism, not cynicism, the kind that seeks understanding rather than denial. Science begins with curiosity, she wrote, and curiosity ends when we decide something is impossible. The case of Michael Anderson stood at that threshold, between evidence and faith, data and wonder. She documented every detail not to prove the supernatural, but to expand the map of the human experience. For Rebecca Anderson, the story continued quietly, far from conferences or journals. She often said that her son's message had changed the way she lived and the way she grieved. She no longer saw death as separation, but as a transformation, like a season-changing form, but not substance. Years later, when she saw Daniel playing in the garden, sunlight in his hair, she sometimes caught herself whispering her old lullaby. And sometimes, just sometimes, he would turn and smile at her in a way that made her heart ache and heal all at once. Dr. Kübler-Ross noted in her writings that such moments, though unprovable, carried truths of another kind. Emotional truths that nourished meaning in the face of mortality. Even if these stories are metaphors, she said once, they are metaphors that heal. And perhaps that was what Michael's legacy truly was. Not a scientific discovery, but a gentle rebellion against fear. A reminder that even at the edge of life, love continues to speak. Years passed, and the story of Michael James Anderson continued to echo in Dr. Kübler-Ross's teachings. It appeared not in her lectures as proof of an afterlife, but as evidence of transformation, the kind that occurs when a person, even a child, faces the end without fear. She often said that Michael had taught her something no textbook ever could, that the way we die is a reflection of the way we have lived. His serenity had touched not only his family, but also doctors hardened by years of loss, nurses who thought they had seen everything, and even strangers who later read his story. During one of her conferences, a young medical student asked, "Dr. Ross, do you believe Michael really came back?" She smiled gently, letting the question settle in the air before answering. "Whether he returned or not is not the point. What matters is that he changed those who stayed." For her, that was the truest measure of any miracle, its ability to awaken compassion. Rebecca, on her part, dedicated her time to supporting other grieving parents. She often carried a small envelope in her bag, one that contained a few of Michael's drawings, the blue field, the singing trees, and the bridge of light. When words failed, she would simply show those images. Somehow, they said everything that needed to be said. Meanwhile, Dr. Kübler-Ross's research expanded to encompass hundreds of near-death cases from around the world. Patterns repeated with astonishing consistency. Patients describing warmth, light, reunion, and overwhelming love. Yet she never allowed herself to claim absolute truth. "To study death," she wrote, "is to study mystery. We don't need to solve it, only to listen." For her, the frontier between life and death wasn't a line, but a vast landscape, one that human beings could glimpse, sometimes for just a moment, when the body faltered and the spirit slipped beyond the measurable. Michael's story became one of those glimpses, a window, not a verdict. It reminded her that the most important task in medicine wasn't to prolong life at any cost, but to honor it fully, even in its final moments. And so, in the quiet pages of her journals, she wrote one last note about him. "Michael taught me that courage can be small, frail, and 10 years old, and still illuminate the mystery that even the wisest of us struggle to understand." In the years that followed, the story of Michael James Anderson spread quietly through hospitals, universities, and circles of grief counseling. Not as legend, but as reflection, a reminder that every life, no matter how brief, can illuminate something eternal. Dr. Kübler-Ross often said that Michael's case wasn't about proving the existence of life after death, but about teaching the living how to face it. In him, she saw not a mystery to be solved, but a truth to be honored. "Children sometimes know what adults have forgotten," she wrote, "that death is only another word for transformation." In her later writings, she described death as a second birth, one that begins where the heartbeat ends. And she used Michael's drawings, the blue field, the bridge of light, the wind that spoke, as visual metaphors for that transition. Rebecca Anderson continued to live in Evanston. Time softened the pain, but never erased the memory. Each year, on the date of Michael's passing, she placed a small bouquet of lilies by the lake and whispered his name into the wind. She said it always felt as if the air listened. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could almost hear his voice, that gentle certainty saying, "It's not goodbye, Mom. Just see you soon." For her, faith no longer depended on doctrine. It became personal, a quiet conviction that love, once formed, never truly disappears. In her lectures, Dr. Kübler-Ross began ending with a single simple thought. Whether we call it soul, consciousness, or energy, there is something within us that does not end with the body. Perhaps death is not the closing of a door, but the opening of another. And with that sentence, she often paused, letting silence fill the room. Because silence, she believed, was where the truth of such things lived. Not in arguments, but in presence. Michael's case remained one of her most discussed, not for its strangeness, but for its beauty. It reminded the scientific world, and everyone else, that the purpose of studying death is not to fear it less, but to understand life more deeply. In the quiet of her study, surrounded by stacks of handwritten journals, Dr. Kübler-Ross often wrote that death was the greatest teacher she had ever met. It humbled intellect, softened ego, and returned all human beings, scientists, parents, children, to the same question: what are we, really? She came to believe that perhaps the point was not to find an answer, but to remain open to the question itself. Michael's story, with its mixture of evidence and wonder, logic and faith, embodied that openness perfectly. When asked in interviews whether she believed in life after death, she would smile and reply, "I don't believe, I listen." The dying have told us enough for us to know we should listen. For her, The near-death experiences she documented weren't proof of heaven or reincarnation. They were windows, glimpses into something vast and compassionate, something that made sense of suffering and turned fear into understanding. She often quoted one of her favorite lines, "What the caterpillar calls the end, the rest of the world calls a butterfly." In Michael's journey, she saw that metamorphosis. The child who had once feared needles and darkness left the world speaking of light and return. The hospital room that had smelled of antiseptic became a place of revelation. The mother who had clung to his hand found, within loss, a peace that outlived despair. Rebecca Anderson never stopped missing her son, but she stopped being afraid of death. She often said that grief didn't vanish, it transformed. "You don't get over it," she told other parents. "You grow around it." And love keeps you alive. Dr. Kübler-Ross carried those same words into her teaching. She reminded her audiences that fear of death is, at its core, fear of losing connection, and that love itself might be the proof that connection can never truly end. "If love is real," she wrote, "then death cannot be the final word." And so Michael's story remained not a case file, not a miracle, but a quiet question that refused to fade, a whisper that followed her wherever she went. What if death is not the opposite of life, but a part of it? As the years went by, Dr. Kübler-Ross often returned to the same thought, that every encounter with death was really an encounter with life itself. Each story, Michael's included, reminded her that what people feared most wasn't dying, but the idea of ceasing to be loved. "If we understood that love is the constant," she said once, "then death would lose its power." In her final lectures, she would pause before telling Michael's story, letting the silence settle in the room. She spoke not as a scientist, but as someone who had stood beside thousands of bedsides and seen light flicker in the eyes of the departing. "I cannot tell you what happens after the heart stops," she would say softly. "But I can tell you this. I have never met anyone who died alone. There is always something or someone waiting." Her audience, often made up of doctors, nurses, and grieving families, would sit still, the room breathing in unison. For a few moments, the barriers between science and spirit dissolved. Rebecca, now older, sometimes attended those talks. She always sat quietly in the back, her fingers tracing the edge of a folded paper, one of Michael's drawings of the blue field. When the lights dimmed, she'd close her eyes and picture that golden bridge stretching toward the horizon. To her, it no longer mattered whether Michael's story proved anything. What mattered was that it healed. Because healing, she realized, isn't about removing pain. It's about finding meaning within it. And in that meaning, she found peace. For Dr. Kübler-Ross, Michael's case came to symbolize the space where medicine ends and mystery begins, a reminder that compassion is the bridge between the two. "We study death," she wrote near the end of her life, "not to conquer it, but to understand the light that shines through it." That light, the same one Michael described, gentle and golden, became her symbol for everything the human heart could still believe, even in the face of the unknown. And now, after walking through Michael's story, from a hospital room in Chicago to the mystery that still echoes decades later, I want to leave you with one final thought. Maybe this isn't just a story about death. Maybe it's about how deeply alive we can be when we face the unknown with courage and love. Each of us will, one day, stand where Michael once stood, between one heartbeat and the next, between what we know and what waits beyond. But if his journey taught us anything, it's that there is no reason for fear when love is still present. So now I invite you to reflect. Have you ever witnessed something that made you question where life truly begins or ends? Has someone you love ever left you a sign, a dream, or a feeling that they were still close? Share your story in the comments. This space isn't just about answers, it's about connection. about people who dare to wonder and who find comfort in knowing they're not alone in that search. Tell us where you're watching from, too. Sometimes the person who understands exactly what you've been through might be living just a few streets away. And if this story touched you, even a little, don't keep it to yourself. Send it to someone who might need hope tonight, someone who's grieving, or someone who's afraid. Because when we share stories like this, we spread light. The same kind of light Michael saw, the kind that never really fades. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for choosing to keep your heart open. There's still so much to learn, so much to feel, and so many stories waiting to be told. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and remember, every ending is just another beginning.